imagine for a second a governing authority that is just so absolute, right? Like so technologically and militarily dominant that it doesn't just dictate where you work or what you pay in taxes.
Right, it goes way beyond that.
Yeah, exactly. It actually demands complete jurisdiction over your internal thoughts. Like if you change your mind, if you just come to a new intellectual conclusion based on verifiable evidence, you don't just get a fine or go to jail.
No, it's much worse.
Right. You are publicly dismembered.
Yeah.
You're crucified for the crime of, I guess you'd call it, unauthorized consciousness. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way, because today we are stripping away the childhood fairy tales, the flowing robes, the Hollywood special effects from one of the most famous stories in human history.
The clash between Moses and Pharaoh.
Exactly. We're diving into a really fascinating scholarly analysis of Surah 10 of the Quran, specifically verses 83 through 93. And it reframes this entire familiar narrative because, it's not a magical showdown between wizards.
No, not at all.
It's actually this brutal, brilliant, deeply sophisticated political blueprint. It outlines the mechanics of centralized tyranny and the exact protocol required to dismantle it through decentralized law.
And this shift in perspective here is just profound because we are so culturally conditioned to view these ancient texts through the lens of, supernatural spectacle.
Yeah, like a guy throws a stick, it turns into a giant reptile, and everyone just gasps.
Exactly. The audience passively watches the magic trick. But the lecture we're unpacking today, it argues that interpreting these events as mere, suspensions of physical laws, it drastically reduces their impact.
Wow.
It totally obscures a highly advanced commentary on sociology, the psychology of oppressed populations, and honestly, the strategic realities of ideological warfare.
Wow.
Yeah, we are basically looking at a masterclass in how power operates, how state propaganda maintains this illusion of invincibility, and how an outmatched minority can methodically collapse a superpower without ever, fighting on the tyrant's terms.
So let's jump right into the belly of the beast then, Pharaoh's court. Because the traditional reading gives us this literal wizard's duel, right? Pharaoh brings out his magicians, they chant some spells, their ropes turn into snakes.
Right, the classic scene.
Right. And then Moses throws his staff that becomes a bigger snake and eats the others. But if we follow the source text's pushback against this literalism, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of that room. I mean, these magicians aren't guys with pointy hats casting hexes, are they?
Far from it. In the context of a totalitarian centralized state, the concept of magic serves a very specific utilitarian function. The source analysis actually identifies Pharaoh's magicians as the architects of state propaganda.
Oh, wow. So they're
the spin doctors, the media conglomerates, the public relations arm of the empire.
That makes so much sense.
Right. Their magic is this deliberate, highly coordinated manipulation of public perception. It's the ability to present systemic exploitation as something beneficial or natural or just completely unbeatable.
So when they throw down their ropes and staffs,
the text frames that as the intricate web of lies, psychological manipulation, and, manufactured data used to ensnare the population and legitimize Pharaoh's absolute rule.
Which makes the entrance of Moses completely different. Because if he's not just a more powerful wizard bringing a bigger parlor trick to the table, what is he actually wielding?
Well, the text identifies his weapon as hack.
Hack?
Yes, which translates to divine law or absolute undeniable truth. It's an immutable reality. So the staff turning into a snake that swallows the illusions, it isn't a biological transmutation.
Okay, so what is it?
It's a metaphor for hard, verifiable data completely eviscerating a carefully constructed narrative.
Oh, man, that reminds me of corporate whistleblower.
Yes, perfect analogy.
Imagine a boardroom full of executives who have just been cooking the books for a decade.
Yeah.
And they have these brilliant, slick presentations, which is their magic, right?
Right.
Showing record profits and total stability. Then the whistleblower walks in and simply drops this massive, heavily encrypted hard drive of the actual unredacted financial data right on the table.
And that's the staff.
Exactly. The data doesn't yell, it doesn't perform a trick, it just sits there. And its mere existence completely vaporizes the illusion. The undeniable reality just swallows the spin.
And the terror that strikes the executives in your analogy, that is exactly the terror that strikes Pharaoh's court. Because if Moses simply performed a supernatural feat that defied physics, it wouldn't actually threaten the ideological foundation of Pharaoh's system.
Right, because it would just prove Moses had access to, a different anomalous power source, Pharaoh might even just try to hire him.
Exactly, he'd want to weaponize it. But by introducing a completely different operating system, one based on undeniable facts, logical consistency, and a transcendent law that applies equally to the king and the slave,
Oh, wow.
Moses is launching an existential attack on the very concept of Pharaoh's authority. He is fighting manufactured perception with objective reality.
But, I mean, introducing objective reality to a tyrant who has built an entire empire on lies, that doesn't usually result in the tyrant just resigning, you know?
No, definitely not.
When absolute unquestioned authority is challenged by a superior logic, the reaction is going to be hyper-violent.
Oh, absolutely. And the text spends considerable time dissecting this reaction. It introduces the term Pharaoh to describe the specific anatomy of this tyranny.
Pharaoh.
Yes, because this wasn't merely a dictatorship interested in resource extraction. The defining characteristic of Pharaoh is totalizing control over human agency. Meaning, when the very architects of the state's propaganda, the magicians who instantly recognized the undeniable truth of Moses' data, when they conceded and aligned themselves with that truth, Pharaoh's response was apocalyptic.
Because they broke the narrative.
Exactly. And his immediate accusation, as highlighted in the text, wasn't about treason in the traditional sense. He screamed, "Did you believe without my permission?"
Wow. Let's just pause and consider the suffocating weight of that specific phrasing. Without my permission. The state is claiming ownership of your actual internal cognitive processes.
Yes.
Like, you are expected to submit a requisition form to update your own worldview. It's terrifying.
It really is. It is the ultimate boundary of totalitarianism. Pharaoh threatens to cut off their hands and feet on opposite sides and crucify them on the trunks of palm trees.
Jeez.
Yeah. And this isn't just an execution, right? It is a meticulously calculated campaign of psychological terror. The brutality is designed to make a public, gruesome spectacle of independent thought.
Right, because by destroying the physical bodies of the people who dared to change their minds, he's sending this visceral message to the rest of the population.
Exactly. He's saying your consciousness belongs to the state, and attempting to reclaim it will result in your complete physical annihilation.
Which, honestly, faced with a system that leverages that level of sadistic, highly visible violence to maintain ideological conformity, the sociological fallout must be devastating.
It is.
Like, who could possibly witness that and still decide to join the resistance? And the text makes a really fascinating demographic note here, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
It points out that it wasn't the masses who rallied behind Moses. And it wasn't the tribal elders. It was only a few youths from his own people, Bani Israel.
Right. And the sociological mechanism at play here is vital for understanding oppressed populations in general. The source material argues that the older generations had been subjected to institutionalized abuse, slavery, and psychological conditioning for so long that their capacity for rebellion had been entirely extinguished.
They were broken.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were suffering from a deeply entrenched generational learned helplessness. When you watch the nail that sticks out get brutally hammered down every single day for 60 years, your brain rewires itself for pure survival.
Right. Compliance just becomes a reflex at that point.
Exactly. The mere conception of a world without Pharaoh becomes an impossibility. And so the elders often become complicit in policing their own people just to avoid the wrath of the state.
Wow, the system has just successfully calcified their spirits. But the youth, they operate on a different psychological timeline.
Right.
They haven't had decades for the propaganda to fully overwrite their internal sense of justice. They still possess, like, a degree of neuroplasticity, or a raw capacity to look at the grotesque inequality of the system and just feel a visceral rejection of it before the fear has fully institutionalized them.
That's spot on. They are the natural incubators for revolution because the state's conditioning hasn't yet overridden their fundamental human drive for autonomy.
Yeah.
However, recognizing that the system is corrupt and actually standing up in front of a tyrant who is promising crucifixion, those are two vastly different things.
Oh, 100%.
And this brings us to a really profound philosophical inquiry within the text regarding the mechanics of belief. It explores the gulf between merely acknowledging a truth intellectually and possessing a conviction so deep it overrides your biological imperative to stay alive.
And that distinction between knowing and believing is something we gloss over constantly. You know, like we treat them as synonyms. You know the sky is blue, therefore you believe the sky is blue.
Right.
But the lecture takes a major detour here,
Yeah.
right, to critique ancient Greek philosophy.
Yes, specifically the Socratic idea that knowledge inherently equals virtue.
Oh, Socrates.
Yeah, Socrates argued that if a person truly knows what is right, they will automatically do it. Wrongdoing in that framework is just a byproduct of ignorance.
But the analysis here fundamentally rejects that Socratic paradox, doesn't it?
Completely. It argues that human beings are not simply rational calculators where, inputting correct data automatically outputs ethical behavior. The intellect is often totally subservient to deeply ingrained desires, fears, and habits.
Right.
The text illustrates this by pointing out that an individual can possess absolute comprehensive knowledge that a specific habit is destroying their life, say, illicitly acquiring wealth or engaging in destructive addictions. And yet, that intellectual awareness does almost nothing to alter their behavior if their internal desires for comfort, status, or dopamine remain unchecked.
It's like the intellect gets hijacked.
Yeah.
Instead of acting as the captain steering the ship away from the rocks, the intellect becomes like a highly paid defense attorney working for the desires.
That is a great way to put it.
It rationalizes the destructive behavior.
Yeah.
It tells you, oh, just this once, or, well, the system's rigged anyway, so I have to play dirty to survive.
Oh.
I mean, if knowledge alone were enough, nobody would ever smoke a cigarette while staring directly at the warning label on the box.
Exactly. And the source material uses a very grounded analogy to clarify this mechanism: the experience of thirst.
Oh, right.
You can sit in a chair and perfectly comprehend the molecular structure of water. You can intellectually master the concept of hydration. But that abstract knowledge will not physically compel you to stand up and walk to a well.
Because it's just information.
Right. What forces you to act is the overwhelming internal drive of physical thirst. The knowledge simply provides the map. The internal desire provides the engine.
So applying that epistemology to the youth standing before Pharaoh, that changes the entire complexion of their courage.
It does.
Because for them to risk dismemberment, their alignment with Moses couldn't just be an intellectual head nod. It wasn't merely looking at Moses' data and saying, yes, Moses, your critique of centralized resource distribution is empirically sound.
Right, because the second the executioners walk in, that intellectual agreement vanishes.
Exactly. You'd say, Moses is right, but I'd really prefer to keep my limbs, so I'll just keep quiet now.
Right. Their belief had to bypass the intellect and embed itself into their core drives. The truth of the divine law had to cultivate a spiritual thirst for justice that was more powerful than their biological fear of death.
Wow.
The knowledge had to transmute into an unshakable conviction. Only when the desire for truth supersedes the desire for safety can an individual actually stand against Pharaoh.
But, I mean, conviction alone, no matter how deep it is, that doesn't dismantle a heavily armed superpower. You can have the most profound internal thirst for justice, but if you take that conviction and just sprint barehanded at a line of chariots, you just become a dead martyr.
Exactly. It's useless without application.
Right. The internal state has to translate into a highly calculated external strategy. And the text introduces the concept of tawakkul here, but it totally strips away the way we usually hear that word used today.
Yes, it really redefines it.
Because usually it's framed as a sort of passive surrender,
Right.
right? Like letting go and assuming the universe or the divine will just fix the problem for you. Let go and let God.
And the lecture strongly critiques that passive fatalism. It characterizes it as an abdication of duty disguised as piety. True tawakkul within this analytical framework is redefined as an active, unshakable trust in the immutable laws of cause and effect that govern the universe.
Okay.
It is reliance on the mechanics of reality.
And the analogy provided in the sources is the farmer, which I think perfectly illustrates the mechanics of this trust. Because a farmer doesn't walk out to a barren field, throw seeds onto hard dirt, go inside to take a nap, and claim he has tawakkul that a harvest will just magically appear.
No, that's not faith. That's just a failure to understand biology.
Exactly. A true farmer engages in grueling, systematic labor. They test the soil, they plow, they irrigate, they plant at the precise depth required, and they weed the field for months on end without seeing a single sprout, let alone a profit.
Right.
And they do this because they have absolute trust in the natural laws of agriculture. They know that if the correct physical conditions are met, the law of the seed dictates it must grow.
And bringing that back to the geopolitical struggle, true faith for Moses and his followers meant recognizing that the sociological laws governing human freedom, justice, and the collapse of tyranny are just as immutable as the laws governing agriculture or gravity. Tawakkul means understanding that if you execute the right actions, aligned with the right principles, the overarching system of reality will inevitably yield a result. You aren't trusting in a random magical intervention. You are trusting the structural integrity of the divine law itself.
Okay, but this introduces a massive tactical dilemma.
How so?
Well, if you are an oppressed, marginalized group, and you deeply trust these immutable laws of justice, how do you actually apply that trust when the tyrant controls the military, the surveillance state, and the entire public arena?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just start planting your quote-unquote seeds of revolution in the town square. Pharaoh's police will salt the earth immediately.
Which is exactly why the divine guidance given to Moses in Surah 10, verse 87, represents such a massive paradigm shift in revolutionary strategy. We can refer to this as the protocol.
The protocol, I like that.
It is a blueprint for asymmetric warfare against a centralized system, and the command is striking for what it deliberately avoids. Moses is not told to organize a public protest. He is not told to petition Pharaoh for gradual policy reform, and he is definitely not told to provoke a premature, noisy uprising in the streets.
Because engaging a totalitarian state on its own territory, where it possesses an overwhelming monopoly on violence and narrative control, that is tactical suicide. You are playing exactly the game Pharaoh wants you to play.
Precisely.
So what is the actual command? What is the protocol?
The protocol is remarkably intimate. It says, make your homes your qibla and establish the system there.
Okay, let's unpack that qibla.
The term qibla generally denotes a focal point or a direction of unified orientation. And establishing the system, which is often translated as prayer or salat, is expanded in this analysis to mean instituting a comprehensive ideological and structural training ground.
So you completely bypass the public square, you take the resistance offline, basically, and drive it deep into the domestic sphere. The strategy is to turn every single household into an ideological incubator.
Yes, and the genius of this approach lies in its understanding of the relationship between the micro and the macro. A society is essentially a fractal, right?
Right.
The overarching state is merely a reflection of the cumulative values held within individual homes. You cannot forge a just, resilient society out of broken, fearful households. By ordering the people to make their homes the Qibla, Moses is decentralizing the resistance.
Wow.
He is breaking the struggle down into nodes so small and so private that Pharaoh's centralized surveillance apparatus cannot effectively monitor or crush them all.
Think about the psychological warfare of this tactic. I mean, Pharaoh believes he has absolute supremacy because he controls the monuments, the markets, the military. He measures his power by what he can see.
Exactly.
But Moses is building an entirely new society, instilling that unshakable conviction we talked about, teaching the immutable laws, training the next generation behind closed doors. It's a stealth operation operating right under the tyrant's nose, invisible because it exists in the quiet conversations at the dinner table and the private instruction of children.
Yeah. It fundamentally reclaims the locus of control. It empowers the oppressed by giving them a domain over which they can actually exercise absolute sovereignty, their own minds and the minds of their families. They are constructing an alternative ecosystem of values.
You know, this protocol feels startlingly relevant right now to, well, to you, the listener, and to all of us, because we live in an era where we are constantly agonizing over the decay of the modern public square, right? The digital spaces, the social media platforms, the algorithmic news feeds.
Oh, absolutely.
We see the polarization, the manipulation by centralized data brokers, and we feel entirely powerless to stop it. We spend our energy shouting into the digital void, hoping to change the macro structure. But this ancient framework suggests that true, lasting societal change never originates in the public square.
No, it doesn't.
It suggests that if you want to dismantle a corrupted system, the work strictly begins by fiercely guarding the intellectual and moral environment of your own living room.
That is a highly precise application of the principle. However, executing this decentralized incubation strategy requires an agonizing amount of time.
Oh, I bet.
You are attempting to outlast a regime by raising a generation with different values. And the psychological toll of that waiting period is immense, which the text addresses with really raw honesty. Because during this incubation, the Israelites have to wake up every single day and watch the oppressor not only survive, but actively thrive.
And that brings us to Moses' moment of profound exasperation in verse 88. He has instituted the protocol. He is doing the quiet, invisible work. Yet he looks around and sees the reality of the geopolitical landscape, and he cries out, essentially asking, why has this tyrant been granted such obscene wealth and splendor, which he only uses to corrupt more people and consolidate his power?
It touches on one of the deepest vulnerabilities of the human psyche, the crisis of faith induced by the prosperity of the wicked.
Yeah.
The danger of a thriving tyrant isn't just the physical damage they cause, it's the cognitive dissonance they create in the minds of those trying to live justly. When an oppressed person, who is struggling to maintain their conviction, watches a corrupt system yield massive material rewards, a toxic doubt begins to creep in.
They start to wonder if the immutable laws of justice are actually real.
Exactly. The wealth of the oppressor becomes a psychological weapon, a piece of evidence suggesting that cruelty and exploitation are the true mechanics of success in the world.
And the temptation to demand a shortcut just becomes overwhelming. Moses essentially prays for a divine intervention that breaks the rules of reality. He wants Pharaoh's treasury instantly turned to dust.
Right.
He wants the wealth wiped out to prove that the universe is just. He wants magic again.
And the response he receives is perhaps the most difficult directive in the entire narrative, yet it is completely consistent with the principle of tawakkul, that reliance on immutable law.
What's the response?
The divine response is, "Your prayer is accepted, now remain steadfast." And the crucial term here is istiqamat, meaning unwavering endurance or steadfastness.
Wow. So the system refuses to provide a shortcut. The divine law doesn't issue a lightning bolt to burn the cash. It confirms that the overarching trajectory of justice is in motion, but it demands that Moses and his people endure the grinding reality of the process.
They have to hold the line.
Right. They have to continue tending the agricultural field of their societal resistance, even when the harvest seems impossible and the neighboring tyrant is throwing a lavish banquet.
Istiqamat is the recognition that the tyrant's wealth will ultimately accelerate his own collapse, but it will happen organically through the mechanics of hubris and systemic overreach, not through a supernatural deletion of his assets. The protocol must be allowed to run its course. The youths must finish their training. The decentralized network of homes must reach critical mass.
But eventually, the incubation period reaches its threshold. The invisible army that has been built behind closed doors has to step out into the open.
Yes, the breaking point.
The conflict transitions from an ideological Cold War into a physical escape, leading to the climax at the water's edge. And once again, the source material aggressively strips away the cinematic magic to reveal a profound alignment with natural law.
The parting of the sea is perhaps the most heavily mythologized event in the entire narrative. But the geographical and linguistic analysis provided in the lecture dismantles the imagery of towering, static walls of water held back by, an invisible force field.
Right, the classic movie shot.
Exactly. The text actually cites modern research, noting that even recent translations by Jewish theological institutions have corrected the geography here. The Israelites were not standing at the edge of the deep oceanic Red Sea.
They weren't.
No, they were navigating a region historically known as the Sea of Reeds. It was a vast, marshy, tidal basin that bridged the Mediterranean and the Red Sea before human intervention altered the landscape.
Okay, so this basin was governed by extreme tidal phenomena. The lecture zeroes in on a very specific Quranic phrase describing the path, tariqan yabasan, which translates to a dry path exposed by receding water.
Right.
So we aren't looking at Moses forcing the water to bend to his will. We're looking at a leader who, through divine guidance, which the text interprets as a hyper-awareness of the natural world and its immutable laws, understands the precise mechanics of his environment.
Exactly.
He times the escape to coincide with a massive recession of the tide. The water pulls back, exposing the seabed, and they cross not through magic, but through perfect synchronization with the physical universe.
And this framing completely shifts the nature of Pharaoh's defeat, because Pharaoh arrives at the edge of the basin with a heavily armored, highly centralized military force. He sees the Israelites crossing the exposed marshland. Now, a strategist attuned to reality would observe the exposed seabed, calculate the inevitability of the returning tide, and halt the pursuit.
Because it's obvious the water is coming back.
Right, but Pharaoh's perception is entirely distorted by his own pharaoh.
His hubris is his actual undoing. He has spent his entire life insulated by yes-men, believing that his centralized power, his chariots, and his authority can conquer any obstacle. He views the physical world as something that must submit to his decree.
Yes.
He completely ignores the immutable mechanics of the tide, because his ego simply cannot compute a force greater than his own military, so he launches his heavy chariots into the basin.
And the natural cycle simply reasserts itself. The tide returns. The heavy wheels of the Egyptian war machine bog down in the marsh. The water rushes back in, governed entirely by gravity and lunar cycles, and the greatest military superpower of the ancient world is drowned.
Wow.
It is a catastrophic failure of a centralized system that believed its own propaganda, destroyed by a decentralized movement that aligned itself with reality.
The ultimate irony. The man who demanded to be worshipped as a god, who thought he could authorize the very thoughts of his citizens, is asphyxiated because he didn't respect the gravitational pull of the moon.
It really is incredible.
But the text slows down time right at the end to examine Pharaoh's final moments of consciousness as the water fills his lungs. Realizing that his military, his spin doctors, and his wealth are entirely useless, he attempts to leverage the only thing he has left. He tries to make a deal.
He screams out that he now believes in the God of Moses.
Right. And this desperate last-second declaration of faith is met with absolute divine rejection. The text essentially responds, "Now, after a lifetime of rebellion and corruption, you believe now when the water is closing over your head."
And this rejection ties perfectly back to our earlier analysis of what constitutes true belief.
Right, because his declaration has absolutely nothing to do with conviction. He hasn't suddenly developed a spiritual thirst for justice or recognized the truth of the immutable laws. He is just experiencing the ultimate biological panic.
Exactly.
His quote-unquote faith is merely a forced, reflexive reaction to the terror of impending death.
The system of divine law requires a conscious, voluntary alignment with truth, while the individual still possesses the agency to choose otherwise. A confession extracted by the immediate, unavoidable reality of death is epistemologically worthless.
It doesn't count.
Right. However, while Pharaoh's soul is lost, the divine decree issues a fascinating mandate regarding his physical remains. God declares that his body will be preserved and cast ashore to serve as a physical monument, a permanent historical warning against the ultimate consequences of arrogance.
And the archaeological validation of this specific detail is just chilling to me. The source text points out that when modern archaeologists finally unearthed the mummified remains of the pharaohs, they examined the body widely believed to be the pharaoh of the Exodus.
And what did they find?
They discovered distinct markings on the flesh damage consistent with the nibbling of fish and small sea turtles. Yeah. It's a physical data point that aligns perfectly with the ancient assertion that his body wasn't lost to the depths, but floated in the sea before being recovered. The self-proclaimed God was reduced to flotsam, preserved not as a deity, but as an artifact of failure.
It is the definitive collapse of the centralized tyranny. The Israelites have survived, the oppressor is dead, and if this were a conventional heroic epic, this is the point where the narrative resolves. The heroes are free, and they walk into a future of unbroken prosperity.
Happily ever after.
Exactly. But the scholarly analysis of this text refuses to offer a simple, sanitized conclusion because human sociology is never that clean.
Right.
Gaining freedom from an external tyrant is only the first phase of the struggle. The text moves on to examine the aftermath, exploring what happens when the formerly oppressed are finally given autonomy and what the Quran refers to as Rizq-e-Tayyib.
Rizq-e-Tayyib. Let's dig into that because I know it's important.
It is. It's a concept that requires careful unpacking. It translates literally to pure sustenance. But within the context of statecraft and societal building, it extends far beyond agriculture or economics. The lecture defines it as the comprehensive, holistic nourishment of a free society.
Okay, so it's not just food.
No, it is the ability to engage in commerce without exploitation, to live under an equitable legal framework, and to possess psychological dignity. It is the structural opposite of the sustenance they received in Egypt.
Right, because in Egypt they had food, but it was the bread of slavery. The calories kept their bodies alive only so their labor could be extracted by the state. Rizq-e-Tayyib is the sustenance of agency. They finally possess an autonomous state built on the very principles they had painstakingly incubated in their homes during the protocol.
They achieved the vision.
They did.
But yet the text documents a tragic reversal. Having attained the perfect structural conditions for a just society, they eventually dismantle it themselves. The overarching threat shifts from external tyranny to internal decay. The text identifies the mechanism of their downfall as ikhtilaf, deep-seated sectarianism, endless dispute, and the fracturing of their unified purpose.
They lost the Qibla. During the darkest days of oppression, the protocol forced them to align their homes toward a single, unified direction of truth. But once the external pressure of Pharaoh was removed and they became prosperous, that unity dissolved.
Yes.
They splintered into factions. They began arguing over granular interpretations of the law,
Yeah.
using those disputes to consolidate power against each other. They stopped facing the same direction. And the brutal reality is that when a society shatters its shared foundational truth and breaks into warring tribes, it doesn't need an external pharaoh to enslave it.
No, it puts the chains back on its own wrists.
Exactly.
And this internal collapse brings us to the final and perhaps most provocative recontextualization in the lecture. The text examines the concept of Qiyamah.
Qiyamah.
In traditional religious vernacular, Qiyamah is almost exclusively translated as the Day of Resurrection, understood as a singular, cosmic, eschatological event at the end of time.
Right, like the ultimate apocalypse.
But the linguistic root of Qiyamah simply means to stand up. The expert analysis argues that while the eschatological meaning exists, in the context of the historical rise and fall of civilizations, Qiyamah refers to a profound systemic revolution in the present world.
Oh, interesting.
When a nation loses its Qibla, fractures into sectarianism, and falls back into subjugation, it is considered socially and spiritually dead. Therefore, a Qiyamah is the momentous event where that dead nation rediscovers its foundational principles, overcomes its divisions, and rises up to stand on its own feet once again. It is a renaissance of the collective will.
Wow. So if I can synthesize the entire arc of this deep dive for you, the listener, freedom is not a static trophy that a society wins and just puts on a shelf. It is a highly volatile state that requires relentless active maintenance. The moment a society stops tending the field, the moment it allows internal division to obscure the immutable laws of justice, it begins to die. And the only cure for that societal death is a new Qiyamah, a massive unified effort to stand back up.
It forces us to read this ancient text not as a historical artifact, but as a cyclical diagnostic tool for any civilization.
And that is exactly where I want to leave you today. We've spent this hour entirely dismantling a magical fairy tale, revealing it instead as an incredibly sophisticated manual on psychological resistance, the mechanics of power, and the danger of internal decay. I want you to take this blueprint and lay it over our modern reality.
This is a sobering exercise.
It really is. We might look around and comfort ourselves with the fact that we don't have a literal monarch threatening us with crucifixion. But the mechanisms of Ayat, the desire to control consciousness, to manipulate perception, and to centralize power, they've simply evolved. We are living in an era of unprecedented data centralization. We are navigating highly sophisticated algorithmic control systems and digital echo chambers that are designed to polarize us, to feed us manufactured narratives, and to keep us endlessly distracted and divided. The modern magicians are the platforms in our pockets, constantly working to shape what we see and ultimately what we believe.
The parallels are undeniable.
So if the ultimate countermeasure to centralized control, a protocol for building bulletproof conscious conviction, is to establish a Qibla in the home, we have to ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. Are our homes still sanctuaries for deep, independent, critical thought?
That's the real question.
Has we successfully insulated our domestic spaces to train the next generation in the immutable laws of truth? Or have we, without even realizing it, invited the centralized pharaohs of the digital age right into our living rooms, staring into glowing screens, and freely surrendering the sovereignty over our minds that the ancient tyrants had to use violence to steal? Take some time to really examine the protocol in your own life. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the narratives you are handed. Keep seeking the undeniable truth. And above all, stay curious.